For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition?
I would like to be, first of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. And I would like to be recognized for a motion and that I've already cleared with the parliamentarian.
By any chance, would it be a motion to subpoena a witness who's not here?
It's a statement that that I feel very strongly about on Mr. Gore, who
I'm making short-circuited if you'll.
No, I don't want to short-circuit it.
No, I said I might be able to if you would allow me just to agree to send the subpoena and not take not take up the time of the folks who actually did bother to show up. As I said in my opening, he's coming to talk at some point or another, whether he wants to or not. So I'm happy to work with you on finding that date. I don't think it's fair to the folks who did show up, particularly when we're operating under a time constraint, to spend a lot of time focused on the one who did not show up. So I'm happy to issue a subpoena, and I will work with the gentlelady from New York to find the right date.
Well, what about next week? And I was up all night working on questions for Mr. Gore because we know that the idea of adding a citizenship question did not come from the professional career employees at the Department of Justice. It came from a partisan political operative, John Gore, and actually my motion did call for him to be subpoenaed, and I am pleasantly surprised that you're willing to do so. Then the question is timing. Can we do it next week? Because the census is on a schedule, and we have to get these questions answered. They have certain timelines they have to meet. Could we reconvene? Maybe we could just adjourn and come back next week, even with the other panelists.
Well, I don't think that's fair to the five who may have plans next week. And let me also offer this. My sending someone a subpoena should not be confused with them talking. I can't make someone talk. I can make them sit at that table and listen to our questions. If my friend from New York would be willing to do so, we can start with the openings, and then you can get someone on your side that can meet with Sharia or Rob or somebody on our side and see if we can agree on a date where something is not already scheduled. I know we have matters next week, and again, I'm just reluctant to inconvenience other people because we have one witness who bothered not to show.
Well, I agree we should go forward. I just respectfully request, and if I get a guarantee from you that you'll move it as quickly as possible, if not next week, the week after.
You have a guarantee from me that we are going to bring him by legal compulsory, if necessary, at a time that our folks agree to. And if they can't agree to it while we're giving opening statements, I'm sure they will report back to us.
Very well.
And then you can go forward with it.
Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I yield back.
With that, Mr. Comstock, you are recognized for your 5-minute opening. I'm sorry. I think, Dr. Jarman, you're giving one for both. Good. That'll save us some time. You're recognized.
That's correct. So good afternoon, Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Cummings, and the members of the committee. Before I begin, I would like to thank the Congress for the recent appropriation and your support for a successful 2020 census. The Census Bureau shares your commitment, and I would like to take this opportunity to update you on our progress. So we are in the midst of the 2018, excuse me, end-to-end census test, and this is our final major field test before the 2020 census. We are conducting the test in Providence County, Rhode Island. Providence represents an ideal location for this test, offering many different situations and challenges that we'll face across the country in 2020, and its demographics mirror those of the nation. The test's self-response phase began with a series of mailings that were sent last month. Tomorrow, we begin the non-response follow-up operations, and I'm flying up tonight to observe the start of that operation. All of the planned innovations and most of the systems designed for the 2020 census are coming together in the 2018 end-to-end census test. With respect to the test and looking forward to the 2020 census, we are maintaining a well-defined schedule and framework for releasing systems. Each system will have its own well-defined scope, requirements, schedule, and costs, and is overseen by an experienced team of project managers. Lessons learned from the 2018 end-to-end census test will be incorporated to enhance and improve the systems for 2020. The Census Bureau has been working closely with our colleagues from the Government Accountability Office, and they were reviewing our progress, and we value their independent assessment and support. We are also engaging the private sector and federal agencies in the area of cybersecurity with the goal of working together to make sure that the information that we collect is protected, can withstand the threat of cyber attacks, and if necessary, contain a threat in a way that sustains service and maintains public trust. Even as we are in the midst of the test, key operations for the 2020 census have already started. Therefore, I would like to touch briefly on the Local Update of Census Addresses program, or LUCA, and the delivery of the 2020 census planned questions to Congress. LUCA provides tribal, state, and local governments with an opportunity to review and comment on the Census Bureau's address list. More than 11,000 governmental units registered for the local program, exceeding the registrations that we had in 2010. The Census Bureau also delivered the planned 2020 questions to Congress in March, as required by Title 13. As background, I'd like to take a brief moment to provide an overview of the process for determining the content on the census. Throughout each decade, regular content reviews are conducted to ensure that the information collected is required by federal programs. Congress has delegated to the Secretary of Commerce the authority to make the final determination of content. Therefore, the Department of Commerce and the Census Bureau also conduct a rigorous legal, technical, program, and policy review of each question to determine whether it should be collected. In December 2017, the Department of Justice requested that the Census Bureau reinstate a citizenship question to provide block-level data for the enforcement of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. This request underwent thorough legal, technical, and policy review. And on March 26, the Secretary directed the Census Bureau to reinstate the question and to further enhance its administrative records, data sets, protocols, and statistical models to provide more complete and accurate data for citizenship. The Census Bureau is currently taking steps to do this, and we will conduct the research and develop a strategy in an open, transparent manner, consulting with expert groups and stakeholders. The Census Bureau's objective is to conduct a complete and accurate census. And as in past decennial censuses, we will mount a robust communications and partnership program to encourage everybody to respond, especially those who are traditionally hard to count. We recognize that communications and partnership are at the heart of reaching traditionally hard to count populations, and our advertising and partnership support materials will be in multiple languages. We will also have a statistics in schools program to help young people understand the importance of the census so that they can take that message home to their families. We also plan to strengthen our national and local partnerships through the work of seasoned partnership specialists. And our efforts to reach traditionally undercounted populations do not stop with communications and partnerships, and through our language program, we will make it possible to respond to the census in 12 languages, and language support materials will be provided in a total of 59 languages. Finally, we are asking federal, state, and local leaders to encourage their constituents to stand up and be counted. It is important to help us ensure that the public knows that by law, census answers can only be used to produce statistics and cannot be used for law enforcement. Anyone who handles census data swears an oath to keep those data confidential for life. Public encouragement and reassurance of this law and our commitment to protecting confidentiality will help achieve our goal of a complete and accurate census in 2020. It is just 2 years until Census Day. However, we are moving at full speed. Much work remains to be done, but we are well positioned to get it done so that we can conduct a complete and accurate census. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Johnman. In my haste to be a good steward of everyone's time, I've neglected to administer an oath, which is required by committee rules, so I'm going to ask everyone if they would please rise. And Dr. Johnman, I will take by your oath that you are averring that what you just said would be true also. If you'd like a minute to consult with your lawyer, you're welcome to. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? May the record reflect all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Mr. Powner.
Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting us to testify on the Bureau's efforts to deliver and secure key technologies for the 2020 census. About half, or $1.5 billion, of the recent $3 billion cost increase for the decennial is associated with IT. Since Secretary Ross announced this cost increase, we have seen strengthened governance at both the Department and the Bureau. This includes the Bureau meeting monthly with Secretary Ross and weekly with the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs. Although positive, we still see need for improvements in the executive-level reports that go to Commerce on systems and security readiness. Your congressional oversight is essential to this transparency, and I would encourage your continued persistence on these systems and security status reports to ensure that progress continues and that risks are mitigated. This afternoon, I will briefly summarize the status of systems development and testing, as well as security readiness. Starting with systems readiness, the Bureau has made progress, having completed development on 30 of the 44 systems. Key systems that need to be completed are the operational control system, the enumeration application, and the fraud detection system. Despite delays, the Bureau plans to have the OCS and the enumeration application fully deployed by July so that it can be included as part of the 2018 end-to-end test. The fraud detection system has been delayed 8 months and is not planned to be ready now until October of this year. Most of the systems that have been deployed still need to undergo key integration testing to ensure that they interface or interact appropriately with other systems. Our written statement shows that all but 8 of the 44 systems still need to undergo some sort of testing, and the 14 systems that still need to be delivered have significant testing remaining, meaning that they must undergo both systems and integration tests. It is important to note that once the 2018 end-to-end test is completed, there will be additional development and testing that needs to occur in 2019 to address new functionality, additional scaling and performance issues, and defects found during the end-to-end test. This performance testing is critical to ensure that systems can handle expected peak loads. In addition to the 44 systems, the Bureau also needs to ensure that key infrastructure is in place and secure. This includes cloud solutions and network and security operations. Regarding cybersecurity, the Bureau, like other agencies, is under constant attack. Recent incidents primarily involve unauthorized access and phishing attacks. The Bureau is working diligently to address security controls, fix known deficiencies, and have the proper sign-off by the Chief Information Officer to ensure that each system is ready for operations. 6 of the 44 systems have this sign-off, 32 need to be reassessed given changes to the systems, and another 6 need to be completed, including the fraud detection system. These reviews are important to assure that cyber risks are at acceptable levels, especially since 39 of the 44 systems contain personally identifiable information. To the Bureau's credit, they have been and plan to work closely with DHS on cyber issues. This includes penetration testing, tabletop exercises, and simulated phishing attacks. It is critical that the cyber vulnerabilities identified in these activities are mitigated to lessen risks to the upcoming 2020 decennial. I'd like to conclude with 3 recommendations regarding IT for the decennial. 1, executives at both the Department and Bureau need to stay engaged on the delivery and testing status of the systems and closely monitor the key risks associated with these systems. This includes the timely delivery of software to the technical integrator for integration testing. 2, the Bureau needs to have rigorous oversight of its contractors during both the end-to-end test and after leading up to the decennial. And 3, there needs to be aggressive management of cybersecurity risks of the systems and infrastructure given the threats and vulnerabilities confronting the Bureau. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement.
Thank you, Mr. Pounder. Mr. Goldenkopf.
Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee. GAO is pleased to be here today to discuss the Census Bureau's readiness for the 2020 head count. As you know, in recent years, we have identified a number of operational and other challenges that raise serious concerns about the Bureau's ability to conduct a cost-effective enumeration, and in February 2017, we added the 2020 census to our list of high-risk government programs. My remarks today will focus on 2 such challenges: implementing design innovations aimed at controlling costs and developing reliable cost estimates that better account for risks and inform annual budget requests. The bottom line is that while the Bureau has made important progress toward mitigating some of the risks facing the census, and we are encouraged by the top-level oversight being applied by the Department of Commerce, The census is now projected to cost $15.6 billion, a $3 billion increase over the Bureau's original estimate, and significant uncertainties lie ahead. For example, with regard to design innovations, to help control costs while maintaining accuracy, the Bureau will use new procedures and technology for 2020, including greater use of automated data collection methods, administrative records in place of data collected by enumerators, verifying addresses using aerial imagery and other in-office procedures rather than by going door-to-door, as has been done in previous decennials, and allowing households the option of responding to the census via the Internet. While the new methods show promise, they also introduce new risks, in part because they have not been used to a great extent in prior decennials, if at all. To help ensure that key systems and procedures will function as planned, since 2012, the Bureau has held a series of tests at various sites across the country. However, citing funding uncertainties, the Bureau has curtailed recent testing efforts. As one example, as was mentioned, the Bureau is currently conducting the 2018 end test. Essentially a dress rehearsal for the actual enumeration, the 2018 test is critical because it is the Bureau's final opportunity to demonstrate that essential census-taking activities will perform under operational conditions. While the Bureau originally planned to conduct the 2018 test in 3 locations, 2 sites, areas of Washington State and West Virginia, were eliminated from a full test because of budgetary concerns, and a complete dress rehearsal will now only be held in Providence County, Rhode Island. Without sufficient testing across a range of geographic locations, housing types, and demographic groups, operational problems can go undiscovered, and the opportunity to refine procedures and systems will be lost. Another risk factor is the Bureau's 2020 life cycle cost estimate. We found that the October 2015 version of its estimate fell short in our 4 best practices, only meeting the characteristics of comprehensiveness and accuracy, and minimally meeting characteristics for being well documented and credible. In December 2017, the Bureau provided us with the documentation used to update its cost estimate, and based on our preliminary analysis, we have found that the Bureau has improved its cost estimation process in each of the 4 best practices. In short, while the Bureau and Department of Commerce have taken important steps to keep preparations for the decennial on track, a number of challenges and uncertainties remain. Going forward, continued leadership attention and congressional oversight will be needed to help ensure key components and systems are fully tested and will function as required, preparations stay on schedule, management functions follow leading practices, and any further cost growth is capped. This concludes my prepared remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Goldenkoff. Professor Levitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Distinguished members of the committee, I appreciate the chance to testify before you today. Enumerating the population is the federal government's very first constitutional responsibility. And with a new question on citizenship added to that mix, we may be about to seriously screw it up. Distinct from the constitutional count of every person, the census also sends a much longer survey to a smaller representative sample. This ACS survey, which you're familiar with, asks a lot. Home size, income, what you do in your job, where you majored in college, whether you've got trouble bathing or dressing. And yes, citizenship. But in the midst of a 40-minute, 28-page survey, the citizenship question doesn't stand out over much. And even so, in 2015 and 2016, in 44 states, more people refused to complete the ACS than had ever refused before in the lifetime of the survey. Last year, census staff noticed an unprecedented groundswell, and that's a quote, of people cutting the survey short or refusing to answer altogether. And they cited concerns about immigration as the reason. You've already heard the census is already considered a high-risk activity, and these ACS responses should have been a big warning, like the smell of gas in a house. And I'm afraid Secretary Ross just lobbed in what might well have been a Molotov cocktail. In March, the Secretary decided to take the citizenship question from the middle of a 28-page survey and slap it onto the basic 10 questions asked of every man, woman, and child in the country, exponentially raising its prominence and risking the basic count in the process. The last time we asked every person in the country about their citizenship, 73% of the public trusted the federal government. That figure is now 18%. If you add a toxic issue to a toxic climate, people won't open the door. As the Census Bureau itself has said, quote, any effort to ascertain citizenship will inevitably jeopardize the overall accuracy of the population count, end quote. It'd be different if we'd done the homework to know that these warning signs, robust as they are, were actually bunk. We have not done that homework. Testing for this census began in 2007, 13 years before it will actually be conducted, because even small design changes can have a big impact. Adding any individual question is a big change. Adding this question is a behemoth. As you've heard before from several other witnesses, the 2020 dress rehearsal, the final run to iron out the details, is currently underway. You've heard that more testing on that is still necessary, and those tiny changes are minimal in comparison to the giant question that has been introduced to the process that is not part of the test. There's not enough time to make Secretary Ross's sea change part of the final rehearsal. The Titanic was launched with more preparation and less hubris. DOJ said they needed this change to enforce the Voting Rights Act, and I'm encouraged that you will seek to get more information about that in weeks to come. My legal career has largely been about voting rights. If the only way to enforce the VRA required asking everyone about citizenship in 2020, I'd be cheering the DOJ on. But it's simply not so. I sat in Mr. Gore's old chair before he did. Like him, I helped lead the Civil Rights Division's enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. For the 53 years since the VRA was passed, every single person who sat in that chair, Republicans and Democrats alike, has enforced the VRA without a citizenship question in the basic decennial count. I've written much more about how and why in my written testimony, and I'm happy to take questions on that later. One last point. A distortion of the basic count affects your constituents. This isn't just about non-citizens. It's not just about the millions of citizens with non-citizen family or friends. It's not just about distrustful populations more generally. Everyone in an area with an undercount loses clout and loses cash. If the census is accurate, states like Texas, particularly Texas, Florida, and North Carolina should get more congressional seats and billions of dollars. If those in your state don't respond in a newly volatile census environment, those benefits vanish for all of your constituents, and they go out to states that manage to do better. This risk is not inevitable. The dress rehearsal doesn't have the citizenship question. Congress could decide to reject these new and potentially explosive changes, or at least delay them until they've been tested to the Bureau's normal standard. I urge the committee to consider such a course. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goldenkoff and Mr. Powner, as of April of 2018, there were 30 outstanding GAO recommendations specific to the 2020 census. Will you please list a few of these major recommendations that have not been implemented?
Yeah, as we have made actually 84 recommendations related to the 2020 census over the last several years. And as you mentioned, to date, 54 have been implemented, 30 are still open. Among the recommendations that are still open, they deal with some research and testing, IT security, systems development, recommendations aimed at strengthening their cost estimation and scheduling processes. So they have been making progress. We do meet with them on a regular basis. They have agreed generally with all of our recommendations, and it's encouraging that they continue to work with us and embrace those recommendations.
So you feel that they're making adequate progress?
And my colleague here, Mr. Pounder, can discuss the IT side of the House. I think that, for where they are, we are, compared to other agencies that sometimes resist our recommendations, it's encouraging that we've been meeting with some high-level people, not only at the Census Bureau, but also with the Department of Commerce, and they are working with us to implement the recommendations. We would always like to see things done faster. We want to see all 30 open recommendations closed. But they are making steady progress. Dave, from the IT?
Yeah, I think clearly they're focused on the right things, getting the systems developed, tested, and secured. The issue here is they were late. There was a big cost increase. A lot of that cost increase went to the IT systems. We got a technical integration contract. There's currently working overtime. You only work overtime when you're behind schedule. So those are the watch list items that we're looking at. But they're clearly focused on the security and testing of those systems.
Do any of these 30 impact the accuracy of the census?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, probably all of them do, either directly or indirectly. I mean, even things, for example, things that are if the Census Bureau starts falling behind schedule, starts implementing things late, if things don't perform as required, if they're unable to meet the operational loads required of the actual census, all those things could ultimately impact accuracy, directly or indirectly.
Would you, could you respond to whether or not, since the time you made the recommendations, that the Census Bureau's had time to implement these, to make sure that we have an accurate census?
Time is running out.
I think that I'm asking, have they had adequate time to resolve these, to respond to these recommendations?
In some cases, more than enough time. We made recommendations back in 2008 on asking the Census Bureau to improve the quality of their cost estimation process, and it was very discouraging that in 2016, when we issued a report on the 2020 cost estimation program, that there were still a number of issues with it, with their cost estimation program. I think they got the message. They got some additional expertise, both in-house and also with the Department of Commerce. And so we've seen some improvements there.
Is there time, is there enough time left to respond, to finish the work that's needed to adequately address the other 30 recommendations?
I think so, if the Bureau prioritizes adequately.
Mr. Jarman, will the Census Bureau be able to complete to fulfill these recommendations before the census?
So thank you very much for the question. So we've responded to GAO with written documentation on all of the recommendations and what we're doing to work on them. I think, as my colleagues here have described, we've been making good progress. A really good example is the life cycle cost estimate, where we work with the Secretary and the team from Commerce to really sort of do a deep dive and get control of the cost estimate for the census.
So we can anticipate and we can count on the Census Bureau to complete all 30?
Absolutely. Okay.
Mr. Golikoff, we would appreciate it if you would provide that list to the committee for the record. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman from Alabama yields back. The gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I particularly thank you for this hearing. It's a valuable service to the public as we approach the time to take the census. I have been so troubled, Mr. Jarman, Mr. Comstock, by the sudden addition of a citizenship question that I have introduced a bill. It's called Ensuring Full Participation in the Census Act, to bar questions about citizenship, nationality, or immigration status. My question to the two of you is, why did this question, which was dropped for 70 years, suddenly appear on the decennial census? What was the point?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman, for the question. We received a request from the Justice Department for this, and their rationale was that the level of the information that they needed to enforce the Voting Rights Act was not available.
And you accepted this at face value, even given your 70 years of believing, by the way, more than half of those years, when the Voting Rights Act has been enforced, you just simply accepted this and simply wrote it down, yes, sir?
No, we took a very hard look at it, as is laid out in Secretary Ross's memo, which has been available to the public. And I think, actually, we would disagree with the characterization that the question has not been asked. It's been asked throughout that time.
We're aware that it's been asked in a way that that was designed to preclude any prejudicial effects on the American, the American, and I forget what you call it.
American Community Survey.
Community Survey. So we are aware of that. And you cite Secretary Ross. When he announced this decision, he wrote that the department, and here I'd like to quote him, was not able to determine definitively how the inclusion of a citizenship question on the decennial census will impact responsiveness. Well, you've been sure enough for 70 years that you've excluded it. But he says you didn't have, you had insufficient evidence. Did you have any evidence that it would not have an impact on the census, asking such a question, particularly given the testimony of Mr. Levitt that people have increasingly refused to answer this question?
Well, if I might respond, if you look at that same memo, you'll notice that he carefully considered the issue, and there was quite extensive discussion of the matter, and that was exactly the point. We were asked, made a valid request by a government agency to add this to the census. We went through our normal process, and we looked at this carefully.
So you're telling me that you pre-tested this question in the exact same way that you pre-tested every other census now on, every other question now on the census?
This question went through the same process. It's been used at 42 million households, so it's been widely tested and used.
I'm asking, was it pre-tested in exactly the same way that other questions were pre-tested? I'm not asking you how you pre-tested it. I'm asking you to make a comparison.
Actually, ma'am, our review of the prior questions and the format for adding them showed that there is not a standard method for doing this. These questions on the short form have been around for a long time.
So you do not believe, in your expert opinion, that asking this a question, even after Mr. Levitt's testimony, will have any effect upon the willingness of people to answer questions? You think that there is no danger here? Is that your testimony, your sworn testimony before this committee?
Ma'am, my sworn testimony before this committee is that, as the record clearly shows, there is no definitive evidence that this will adversely affect the responses.
All right, I'm going to discard that question because of because of the evidence we've already had.
If I may finish,
in order to get to my last question, I'm going to ask Mr. Goldenkopf, in his testimony prepared for the House Appropriations Committee last month, you noted, sir, the, quote, risks associated with late changes of any nature to the design of the census if the Bureau is unable to fully test those changes under operational conditions. So I'll ask you whether or not you think that there are any risks associated with this late change in the design of the census because they were unable to fully test those changes under, quote, operational conditions.
The gentlelady's time has expired, but you may answer the question.
Oh, I thought I was going to be saved by the bell. As we said, it's exactly that any change, whether it's a change to the content, change to the program, when it occurs late in the life cycle of the census and is not operationally tested, raises risks. You don't know what you don't know.
Thank you very much.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized, Mr. Issa.
Well, let me do a follow-up on that. The census mandated by the Constitution should, in a pure constitutionally mandated sense, simply say how many people are here and ask no further question, because that would meet the requirement for who is where, correct?
And its base.
Okay, so isn't every question over and above that, and it's a long form, in fact, causing people to get bored, not happy with it, fill in the blanks quickly, and sometimes not pay a lot of attention? Isn't there essentially a loss every question you ask after the one that is required every 10 years by the Constitution? Just a yes or no if you can.
It's not that simple.
Well,
that
is a shorter form more likely to be answered accurately and returned in greater amounts?
The Bureau has found, and this is just in surveys in general, the shorter the form, the less burdensome.
Okay, so we're going to recognize that all questions have that effect. But let me go back over to the Census Bureau itself. Doctor, isn't it true about 42 million people have answered this question substantially just on the ACS?
That's correct.
Okay, so this is not something new and exotic. President Obama caused this to be asked. But in the opening statement of the ranking member, who I apologize, I guess isn't here right now, but he said no one has ever been compelled to answer this. Mr. Comstacker, one of you, is the ACS like voluntary? When I got a copy of it, it basically told me do it or else, right? Isn't that compelled, and even if not required by the Constitution?
You're correct, Congressman, that Congress has passed a law that says that you are required to answer the census.
So the ranking member was simply dead wrong, misinformed when he said that no one's been compelled. In fact, throughout our history, this question has been asked, and 42 million people, many of them during the Obama administration, answered this question. We're compelled to, correct?
Point of inquiry. Which statement is he referring to?
Would you please stop the clock, because I'm not yielding for a point of anything unless you stop the clock.
You're saying the ranking member's statement?
His opening statement said that no one had ever been compelled to do this before. I wrote it down as he did it.
I don't believe he said that. Let's double check his statement.
Well, you can certainly go back to the record.
Okay, check the statement. Go check it. Go check it.
If I can reclaim my time, please. So, assuming that he said it or didn't say it, it is in fact mandatory, has been mandatory, and President Obama during his 8 full years caused the ACS to be sent out with this mandatory question which has been answered. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So except for politics, what has changed in the 8 years of this being asked by the Obama administration versus it being asked of everyone that you know of?
Well, I think the important point that the Department would make and the Bureau would make is that rather than focusing on the compelling people to answer the question, it's more importantly the data collected is confidential, and that's mandated by law as well that Congress passed. So this data is
bingo. That's why it wasn't political when it was being gathered during by the ACS. Well, let me ask a question. If it was good enough to be on the ACS and important enough to be asked 42 million times, and for Dr. Jarman, today with 42 million samples, are you in fact without the confidence that you know the figure, and if you flushed the figure of people answering that question against independent information and records, that you could come up with an accurate, reliable statement of how many citizens and non-citizens are in a particular location?
So I think the issue between having the question on either the old long form of the census or now on the American Community Survey is not an issue of the accuracy of those instruments. They are accurate to a certain level of...
But there is sampling on the ACS, yes. And on the full form, right. It would be 100% that you then would flush against other data.
So the Justice Department requested block-level information, and so the American Community Survey's sampling rate is simply not high enough to resolve down to that level.
So if you tried to use that information to help do your job, Mr. Gore's job in this case, you would be unable to because you could not assert that there was sufficient accuracy because of the small size of the sampling by block.
Right. So from the Census Bureau's technical review, we could not produce reliable block-level estimates using.
So the only way, if I can paraphrase, the only way to achieve what apparently was asked for by the Obama administration for 8 years with accuracy down to block level is to do what you're doing. Isn't that true?
I don't think that before it was asked for at the block level.
Right, but the information asked for 42 million times, many of them during President Obama's, much of them during President Obama's term, was not sufficiently accurate. It did not have enough statistical accuracy for it to be used at block level, which is what the Department of Justice asked for.
Yeah.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I thank the gentleman.
We'll now recognize the gentleman from New York and the gentleman from North Carolina after that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. Just as a point of information, it was not in the chairman's, or rather ranking member's opening statement. We're checking his spoken statement now on whether or not he actually said that. Okay, well, first of all, I would like to ask Mr. Chairman to have unanimous consent that this resolution that passed yesterday by the Westchester County, New York Board of Legislators opposing the inclusion of a citizenship question on the census be added to the record.
Without objection.
Okay, thank you. And this builds on 18 AGs and many cities across the country that are filing suit and objecting to this question. First of all, after Secretary Ross testified before this committee 7 months ago, I submitted 15 questions for the record that to this day have not been answered. And I respectfully request permission to put in the record those 15 questions that have not been answered.
Without objection.
Okay. And as a committee, every single Democrat signed a letter where we requested documents and communications from both Commerce and DOJ surrounding the process by which a citizenship question was added at the last minute. And I first would like to ask Mr. Comstock, and I would like permission to place in the record that, letter that we sent with every Democrat on it.
Without objection.
So Mr. Comstock, do you know where the Commerce Department's response is?
Thank you, Congresswoman. As you are well aware, the matter's under litigation, and as the Department has said many times, the administrative record will be produced as part of that litigation, and it would be outside the bounds of that for us to respond in advance of that litigation.
So when are we going to see the answers?
When we file our response with the court.
Well, you know, litigation is separate from oversight. And we have asked for this more than a month ago, and neither the Department of Commerce or the Census Bureau has provided a single document which this committee requested in response to our letters. So I'd like to ask Dr. Jarman, where are the documents that we requested, and why haven't you produced them? Now, when you say that it's under litigation, we have the executive branch is separate from the legislative branch, and we have a duty of oversight. So when are we going to see these documents, Mr. Jarman?
I'm sorry that the answer is the same. It's under litigation, and those documents are being collected as part of the administrative record for that litigation.
Well, we are not a court. We're a separate branch. So what is the timetable for producing those documents for the courts? And when you do produce it for the courts, will we be able to have access to them?
I understand they're trying to expedite it as much as possible, but I can't tell you when that would be.
And will we have access to it when you submit it to the court?
Yes.
Okay. And I would say that we have this responsibility for oversight. We can be conducting parallel investigations at the same time. And I have never once heard our Republican colleagues say that we should wait on this committee's oversight requests while private litigants are given priority. So why won't you produce the documents? There is no legal reason why you cannot produce the documents, Mr. Jarman.
Would the gentlelady yield for question?
No, I'm waiting for Mr. Jarman's answer.
So we are under the advice of our counsel to do this. So
let me ask you this. If we give you until Memorial Day, will you commit that you can get us the documents?
Again, I can't give you a precise date, but I think we would like to get them out as soon as possible.
Well, I would say, Mr. Chairman, that this is an outrage, and if they can't produce the documents, then I think we should have a subpoena. We should have a right to vote on a subpoena to get those documents, and I will, at this point, yield to my good friend from the great state of California, and
I thank the gentlelady. I think I heard an answer from him that I hope we clarify. I believe he said he would give them to us substantially simultaneous with when they went out, which, to be candid, is as good as this committee has often ever done. If every FOIA request that went to an outside group went to us at the same time, that would be an improvement in some cases. So I think that's the commitment I heard, and I hope that's what we can count on.
Reclaiming my time. Mr. Levitt, is there any reason why they shouldn't submit these documents now?
The gentlelady's time has expired. If you have a pithy answer, you can give it.
I don't know of any legal reason, Congresswoman.
Oh, it's pithy. The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized, and then the gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I want to thank all of you for your work on this census. Much of the questions today are revolving around one question, when in actuality, the deployment of the census is much greater than that. In fact, this question is such a minute part of whether we can deliver or not. It is discouraging to see the disproportionate amount of emphasis that we're placing on one question. Mr. Powner, I'm going to come to you because you have been my expert for a long time on this. You know I've raised multiple concerns. Can you characterize whether you feel better about where the Census Bureau is in their deployment than you did 90 days ago?
We feel better about it for a couple reasons. One is I think the governance that's occurring at the department level has been strengthened. That helps. When you get folks at the department level engaged on that, that's good. There's also been some movement within the Census Bureau with different folks being involved and expertise there, so we like that. But I will caveat that by saying, you know, we have 30 of the 44 systems fully developed, and there's a lot of testing that remains, but more so than that integration testing, getting ready for the end-to-end test, you know, making sure these things are secure, that's probably the highest risk item.
Well, I thank you, and the census folks know that we will hold them accountable. They have been very responsive. I want to say that not only to you, Dr. Jarman, but to all the staff that honestly does most of the work. I can tell you've given me a number of briefings. I thank you for that. Also, Mr. Goldenkoff, I want to come back because under questioning a few minutes ago, you acted like one question could make the make or break difference in whether we actually deploy the census. I'm sure that you did not mean that in that kind of context, since there's only some 30-plus systems that have been deployed out of 40-plus systems. Wouldn't you say those systems being deployed are a lot more critical than perhaps the addition or subtraction of one question?
What I said was any late changes add risk to the cost effectiveness of the census. So whether it was the addition of one question.
But I remember when you were answering that, so let me interrupt since I only have 5 minutes. I remember in the context of that, we were talking about systems and deploying those systems. That was the context of where you made that statement, because I was very keenly aware that we weren't making critical path decisions. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Mr. Levitt, let me come to you. I noticed from your bio that you're an Associate Dean of Research. Do you have, I guess, a degree in statistics?
I don't.
Okay. So you're a lawyer?
I'm a lawyer. I've done a great deal of statistical work in combination with voting rights.
So do you have any background in sampling or statistics or anything that would give you the ability to testify as an expert in terms of statistical samplings?
No, I rely on the Census Bureau's own statements in that regard.
All right, so you're relying on the Census Bureau except in this particular case?
No, I'm relying on the Census Bureau saying, and I quote, any effort to ascertain citizenship will inevitably jeopardize the overall accuracy of the population.
All right,
that's not my words. Those
so
are
let me
theirs.
go back to your background, because in your opening testimony, I think you talked about the Titanic launch.
Yes.
Were you there?
I was not there.
So would you say you're an expert on Titanic launches?
I know how it turned out.
Okay, so you know how it turned out based on what?
I know how it turned out based on historical records.
All right, so let me go back to that, because you were at the Department of Justice, were you not?
Yes, sir.
Do they not use sampling there with regards to Voting Rights Act?
They use the results
of sampling.
Yes.
So I don't normally ask questions that I don't know the answer to, but good. If I'm incorrect, you correct me. They use sampling.
They use the census information.
So you don't actually have to count everybody in your previous job at the Department of Justice to get an accurate reflection of Voting Rights Act violation.
Correct.
All right. So why would that same model not work here with regards to questions? I mean, it's a statistical example. If indeed you're counting everyone and you have a certain non-compliant sampling, wouldn't you be able mathematically to figure out what that is?
That's permissible with respect to the ACS, with respect to the survey where the citizenship question currently is. And that's part of why the Department of Justice is able to rely on that information. I believe that Congress has precluded that for purpose of the decennial count. And that's why the decennial count is
so you're suggesting that we will not be able to count everybody?
Correct.
Are you suggesting that we counted everybody in the last census?
I'm suggesting we got as close as we possibly could.
No, that's not. You answered a question I didn't ask. Did we count everybody in the last census?
The gentleman's time has expired.
I'll yield back.
We did not.
The gentleman from North Carolina yields. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized, and then we'll go to the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Chairman Gowdy, and thank you for holding this hearing. Perhaps I can shed a little light on this issue for my friend from North Carolina who just asked a question. But many have argued that the addition of a citizenship question is a transparent attempt to overlook minorities and quite literally make them disappear from our population, even though the Constitution clearly requires a count of every person living in the United States. The packet of proposed questions for the 2020 census seems to reinforce that impression. The justification for the citizenship question on the decennial census reads only, and I quote, "These statistics are essential for enforcing the Voting Rights Act and its protections against voting discrimination," end of quote. But the justification for the question on the ACS reads, and I quote, "These statistics are essential for agencies and policymakers setting and evaluating immigration policies and laws, seeking to understand the experience of different immigrant groups and enforcing laws, policies, and regulations against discrimination on national origin." Dr. Jorman, why the disparity in the justifications? Can we start there?
I think the justification on the ACS was the one that was on there before, and the additional, and so all of that extends to the census question. The additional text about Voting Rights Act was added to the census justification.
Now, I guess you expect us to believe that this Justice Department is really sincere about enforcing the Voting Rights Act. Is that your assumption? Or do you think they're sincere?
It wasn't my place to take whether they were sincere or not. That was a policy discussion that was reviewed by the Secretary.
Fair enough. Is the difference reflective of the fact that the department knew the public would be suspicious of the addition of the citizenship question? Dr. Jarman, or you can try, Mr. Comstock.
Once again, we'll just point out that this was requested by the Department of Justice for their statutory duty to enforce the Voting Rights Act. So the fear that is being placed out there is being placed out there by public officials who are, I think, generating something that is not there. The bottom line is this information is protected. It may not be used for immigration enforcement or any other purpose other than statistical purposes. And that's the message that the Department of Commerce will be communicating to the public. We're working very hard to ensure that all people are counted. And that's the message that we're trying to get out there. So You know, with due respect, Mr. Levitt's testimony makes clear there is not evidence to support his claim.
Okay, don't put words in Mr. Levitt's mouth, but the differences here are concerning. But what is also concerning is the fact that the administration has given two questions disparate treatment. In January, OMB denied the Bureau's recommendation to add a combined question on race and ethnicity to the census. Years of comprehensive testing showed that the Bureau's revised question actually would improve the accuracy of the census. Dr. Jarman, isn't that true?
That was the finding of the research that was done throughout the decade.
Okay,
yes.
so that's true. And then yet after years of testing showing positive impacts on the quality, the Trump administration declined to include this question, overruling the statistical experts at the Census Bureau like it did with the citizenship question. But this time there was extensive empirical evidence to support the Bureau's recommendation. Mr. Comstock, why did the administration decide not to add a well-tested question that would increase accuracy while adding the untested citizenship question that will decrease accuracy? Can you answer that?
Well, we disagree that adding the citizenship question will decrease accuracy. We think, and in fact, it will increase accuracy because, as was pointed out earlier, the citizenship response on the ACS is a sampling question.
You don't think people that are not citizens will be suspect of the question?
The gentleman's time has expired, but to the extent my friend asked a question, you're welcome to answer it.
All right.
Again, we think that the people who were not going to respond have already made that decision, and the evidence so far does not indicate that a citizenship question will influence that outcome.
My friend from Missouri yields back before we go to the gentleman from Georgia and then the gentle lady from New Jersey. Just a reminder to my colleagues, as we previously discussed, Mr. Comstock and Dr. Jarman have a commitment at 3 o'clock. We wish that they could stay longer, but we're grateful that you stayed longer than some other witnesses we invited. With that, Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Jarman, I want to shift gears a little bit because I've got another issue that I have some concerns that has come to my attention and that we've been looking into. The Census Bureau knows that there's some degree of plurality within citizenship that is going to refuse to respond to any online or mailing efforts, correct?
I think that we know on all surveys there's always somebody.
There's always some degree of the citizenship that will not respond. It's also my understanding that after 6 attempts at contacting these individuals, that then the Census Bureau begins consulting with state, local records, as well as checking credit bureau data, that type of thing, correct?
So we do have a corpus of administrative records that mostly includes federal administrative records, but also some state administrative records as well, yes.
Okay. What credit bureaus is accessed?
I don't think that we're actually using credit bureau data for this purpose, but I can get back to you and
check into, because I've been told otherwise. And my question with that is, obviously these are publicly traded for-profit companies, and I want to know if the government is paying these businesses for data.
We have paid such organizations in the past, but for other purposes, for research purposes in 2010.
What authorization is there without consent from the individuals to access that kind of information?
We entered into a normal contract with these organizations, assumed that they have the authority to transmit that data to third parties.
Without permission of the individuals? So you can access credit records without permission from the individual?
So I don't believe that we got the whole credit record. I think we basically got information on their name and address.
Well, aren't there other places where you can get names and addresses besides credit bureaus? I mean, can't you go to the local electric company and find some names and addresses?
So electric company records are part of what these sort of third-party aggregators.
Yeah, that's one thing, and that makes sense. But going to credit bureaus is, I mean, even to get a credit check, you've got to have permission from the individual to get a credit check. It just greatly concerns me that potentially we're getting information without individuals having permission,
right, so
granting permission.
So when we put this out for bids in the past, I'm not quite sure what we're doing right now on this, and again, I can get back to you on that. One of the things that we were trying to do with this sort of combination of, it was many different sources that included utilities and what have you, was to be able to know that a person was at a particular address at a particular time. So like on census.
Yeah, I get that, but I don't get the use of a credit bureau to get that information. I mean, you look at the disaster, for example, that we had with Equifax last year. You look at the disasters we've had with DHS and OPM and the VA, where there have been significant government breaches of data and information. What of any kind of assurance possibly could an individual have that the government accessing potentially, even if it's just name and addresses, there's other, how can there be any assurance that other information is not kept, stored, and potentially at risk?
Absolutely. I can give you every assurance that all of personally identifiable information that the Census Bureau obtains, whether it's from a direct collection or from an administrative record, is protected under Title 13 and used only for statistical purposes and not shared with anybody. Well,
don't you think that DHS would have said that their information likewise is protected, or the VA or OPM or any others? I mean,
I don't think that they have Title 13 of the U.S. Code that expressly forbids us from.
I would like, if you would, to dive into this a little bit further. There's a great deal of concern that I have with obtaining this information without permission from individuals, and why you do not need consent, or why you don't think you need consent from individuals to access credit information, and how secure that information is. It's just it's an alarming fact that I want some information on.
So Title 13 of the U.S. Code authorizes the Census Bureau, and in fact encourages the Census Bureau to, when it can, obtain data from government and private sources in lieu of direct collection. So we are encouraged by law to use other sources of information when we can.
Without permission of individuals to access, where no one else in the country is able to access that information, but you have consent.
So we are authorized under law to collect those sources of information.
Without consent.
If a third party does not.
I mean, if you're gathering that information and you're not getting consent, then you are doing so without consent.
So we do not get anything from a third party that they do not have the authorization to share on forward.
Without consent of individuals. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now, I misspoke. We'll now go to the gentleman from California and then the gentleman from Oklahoma. Mr. Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Mr. Jarman, according to the Census Bureau standard, pre-testing questionnaires and related materials for surveys and censuses, questions should not be added if it is unclear how they will affect responsiveness. It says this, quote, if there is insufficient evidence about how well a question performs, the questions might be subjected to some form of questionnaire pretest. Why was a pretest not done in the case of the citizenship question?
So in this particular instance, I mean, so when we talk about pretesting, that's usually in the context of a question that's never been asked before, and we're trying to understand whether respondents understand the question, have the information available to answer it, and can do so. In the case of citizenship question, it's been asked on the long form of the census.
Thank you, Mr. Jarman.
Let me for many years.
Also, on the memo directly from Secretary Ross, he says the Department of Commerce is not able to determine definitely how inclusion of a citizenship question on the decennial census will impact responsiveness. So already right there, he admits in the memo you're not certain how it's going to impact responsiveness. And if you go back to basically the Census Bureau standard, it should not be included if you don't know how it's truly going to impact. So let's move on real quick because none of us have a lot of time. Is it accurate to say that the census and the American Community Survey are similar but substantially different undertakings?
Yes.
I understand it can take 5 or more years to add a question to the American Community Survey. Why does it take so long?
Every question on the American Community Survey and on the census has to have a statutory reason, so there's a review that goes through. If it's a new question, it needs to be tested.
So one of the things that I'm trying to get at is in the memo, from Secretary Ross, he doesn't state the procedure of asking a new question. And even in the ACA, the American Community Survey, this is how a question becomes part of the American Community Survey. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with that. Why weren't any of these steps taken in adding the citizenship question? I know you said it was on the American Survey, but it wasn't on the specific decennial census. Why weren't any steps taken?
I think that those steps were taken. There was a demonstrated statutory need. There was a legal and technical and policy review. The fact that we'd been asking the question for many years was assumed as that we did the cognitive testing of the question.
Let me go back to the memo from Secretary Ross, right? So you're saying we've tested all these questions. We know that it's not going to really have an impact. But one part of the memo, he basically says that they don't know if the citizenship question is going to impact responsiveness. Then you go to the end of the memo, and it says, to minimize any impact on this decennial census response rates, I'm directing the Census Bureau to place the citizenship question last on the decennial census form. So it's like you're trying to say it's not going to have any impact, but everywhere in the memo, it says, we don't know, or if it is, we're going to try to take steps that minimize, right? So that's why you see a lot of us that are confused, because you're saying one thing and it's a complete something
Mr.
else.
Gomez, would you yield for 30 seconds?
Yes.
Okay, just to clarify the point my colleague's making, I'd like to place in the record with unanimous consent a letter by 6 former heads of the Census Bureau, some Republican, some Democrat, and all of them are objecting to adding the census question at the last minute and saying the citizenship question at the last minute and saying they believe it will result in an undercount. May I put this in the record?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Real quick, Mr. Comstock, on April 25th, 2018, Attorney General Sessions testified in the Senate regarding the citizenship question that, quote, people don't have to answer it, really. I would think that's a very reasonable thing, and I think concerns over it are overblown. Is the Attorney General encouraging people not to respond to the census, or is he saying that their responses aren't really that important since responses are really not required?
Well, I can't speak for the Attorney General.
So it seems like I would love for the DOJ to be here, but what we're really getting at is that the whole reasoning of adding the citizenship question is wrapped around politics, right? And then adding the citizenship question should be tested. Even your memo says you're not certain. And if you take it in light of the testimony of Secretary Ross, which he said the immigration enforcements of this administration are creating an atmosphere of fear, he agreed with that you had to take into your account your response rates. You lowered it from 2010 to about 53% that you're expecting. So you lowered it. So you're already taking into account the atmosphere. So adding a citizenship question also has an impact if you take it in context of everything else that's going on in the country. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Before Mr. Comstock and Dr. Jarman leave, when can the committee expect your 2018 appropriations plan?
So we're working with the department and OMB on that right now. I don't have my CFO with me, so we can get you an answer on that. I think soon.
How do you define soon?
Within the next couple weeks, hopefully.
See, it's the word hopefully that causes me to actually lose hope. So that's a lawyer word.
Right, yes, I understand.
Tells me not to get too excited about the date that you gave me right before you said hopefully.
I will do everything in my power to expedite it.
Does anyone have more power than you do to give it to us?
I think even saying the Secretary, but OMB is involved in this process, and so we will work diligently to get it done quickly.
We'd love to have it as soon as possible.
I appreciate it.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Jarman, according to the Census Bureau, the reason that the census language was put in the Constitution was to determine the numbers of people living in the United States and to empower the people to determine representation in the United States in their representative form of government. Is that accurate?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Levitt, who determines representation in government, citizens or non-citizens?
The people elect representatives, and so.
And would those people be citizens or non-citizens?
Citizens.
Okay. The 14th Amendment grants citizenship to anyone born or naturalized in the United States. Do you think that that was a good idea?
I do.
Okay. The 15th Amendment provides, quote, the right of citizens of the United States to vote, and they shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Did you think that that was a good idea?
Marvelous idea.
Okay. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 applied to citizens, specifically stated in the Act, and prohibits test or abridgment to uphold the 14th and 15th Amendments. Do you think the Voting Rights Act was a good idea for citizens?
Exceptional idea.
Okay, great. Would upholding the rights of citizens, Mr. Levitt, to vote, to be properly represented, be wrong?
No, that's exactly, I think that's exactly what we're all striving for, and it's the potential to put that in jeopardy that has me concerned about the question.
Okay, so would not protecting citizens' right to vote by not having an accurate count of citizens living in the country and others living in the country, could that be an abridgment upon their voting rights?
Yes, I emphatically think that we need an accurate count.
I think it could be an abridgment on their voting rights. And it sounds like the 14th and 15th Amendments and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, Mr. Chairman, and we all agree were great ideas. And I think what we see, which what Mr. Comstock was alluding to earlier, that this is precisely what we're trying to prevent, is to see a prevention of abridgment on citizens of the United States being properly represented in government. Mr. Chairman, in U.S. versus Moriarty in 1901, and this is just one example, the courts have continuously upheld the types of questions and things that are asked on the census. But the Constitution's Census Clause, quote, in this case, does not prohibit the gathering of other statistics, if necessary and proper, for the intelligent exercise of other powers enumerated in the Constitution. And in such case, there could be no objection to acquiring this information through the same machinery by which the population is enumerated. Mr. Comstock, I mean, was that a good ruling in 1901 that allowed the census to ask other things?
We certainly think so. It makes the data collection efficient and less burdensome on the citizen.
And not only that, but Mr. Chairman, I would argue that this case was also used to determine many things, such as legal tender cases, such as housing and who lives in it and who doesn't. Different types of things that we ask on the Senate would not be an abridgment of the Fourth Amendment based upon that the Constitution's Census Clause does not prohibit the gathering of other statistics. I mean, we've seen that upheld repeatedly by the courts. And so I guess my question, Mr. Comstock, why is everybody so upset with upholding the Constitution suddenly?
Well, we think that's a good question, and I just reiterate again that the goal of the Department of Commerce and the Census Bureau is to count everyone and do it accurately, and we think that this will help improve that and allow for the better enforcement of the rights. And I just add to your point, which is that even the United Nations recommends to all members that they ask questions on citizenship. And it's followed a practice that's followed by Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Indonesia, Ireland, Mexico, Spain, the United Kingdom, amongst others. So this is not an unusual or
no, in fact, it goes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson and his original intention that he wanted to put the census language enshrined in the Constitution so that a government could not use it to collect property or to do undue taxes or to usurp its power, but rather to determine how its citizens could be properly represented in government. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman from Oklahoma yields back. I note that it is after 3 o'clock. We'd love for you to shirk your next appointment and stay with us, but if you don't want to do that, you're free to leave if that's what you want to do. And with that, the gentlelady from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start, I'd like to just clarify the record here. The gentleman from California asserted that our ranking member Cummings had made certain statements and claims in his opening statement. That was unfortunate because the ranking member wasn't even in the hearing room at the time. So we went back and reviewed the ranking member's written opening statement. We also had our staff listen several times to the audio. At no time did ranking member Cummings make the assertions claimed by the gentleman from California. So I just want to make sure that this is clear to everyone in this room now, and I know the hearing record also will reflect that as well. Thank you. So, beginning my questions really quickly, Mr. Comstock, please don't leave. I only have one question for you. The Justice Department has argued that a citizenship question on the 2020 census is, quote, critical to the department's enforcement of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. But a coalition of some of the nation's most preeminent voting rights groups has said that is false. In a letter to Secretary Ross on March 22nd, the groups wrote, and I quote, DOJ maintains that a new citizenship question will ensure better enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. Underline, this is false, close quote. The letter goes on to say, quote, a mandatory question on citizenship has never been necessary to ensure robust protection of the right to vote. That is just as true now as it was in 1965. Professor Levitt, you worked on the voting rights cases for the Justice Department. Do you ever feel that the decennial citizenship data was necessary to upholding the Voting Rights Act?
I did not.
Thank you.
In fact, I fear that asking for the question on the decennial rather than where it currently exists would impair enforcement of the Voting Rights Act.
In your written testimony, you noted that you reviewed every voting rights case brought by both Democratic and Republican administrators in the past 18 years, and you found that ACS data was sufficient for all of these cases, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. I find it odd that the Justice Department would hinge its argument on the need to strengthen voting rights enforcement when it has actually taken steps to undermine voting rights at every turn. Attorney General Sessions has called the Voting Rights Act, quote, intrusive, and his Justice Department has reversed its position to be in line with voter suppression efforts in 3 voting-related court cases. The department also recently removed prior references to racial gerrymandering from its U.S. Attorney's Manual and has failed to file a single new voting rights case during the Trump administration. And that doesn't sound like an administration that finds enforcement of voting rights critical, important, or necessary. Professor Levitt, how many lawsuits has DOJ brought to enforce Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act under the Trump administration, to your knowledge?
I'm not aware of any. It's continued litigation that was begun in the past, but I'm not aware of any new ones.
Thank you. Mr. Comstock, did DOJ tell you how many cases do they think would be litigated with this additional citizenship data? Do you know if anyone has been asked to investigate that question?
Well, again, I can't speak for the Department of Justice, but I would observe that this information will become available after the 2020 decennial census. So it won't be necessarily the Trump administration Department of Justice that would be enforcing this. This is data that will be collected and available for the use of whatever administration happens to be sitting in the White House at the time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Comstock, from your ears. Professor Levitt, if fewer people respond to the census and the undercount rate for minority populations increases, won't we end up with the data that is less accurate?
Yes, and that's precisely what I'm concerned about, is that asking this question will actually decrease response rates differentially, decreasing the accuracy of the total count.
Will the less accurate data help us enforce Voting Rights Act?
It will not. It will actually impair that objective.
Based on your extensive experience, do you believe additional cases could be litigated with the decennial data?
Not by putting this question on the decennial in this climate, no.
Thank you. The United States Commission on Civil Rights, which is an independent bipartisan federal agency, wrote Secretary Ross stating, quote, critical enforcement of our nation's civil rights laws depends in part on a true and fair count of all Americans, not a process that is jeopardized by a hasty decision to include a question that could have far-reaching ramifications for the health of our country. There is simply no basis, close quote, there is simply no basis for the department's claims, and if the department still feels otherwise, I would encourage it to expediently respond to our request for documents relating to this basis so that we can determine what is indeed best for this country. My time is up. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Arizona, Dr. Gozar, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levitt, what kind of government do we have?
We have a representative government.
Representative republic.
Yes.
I'm glad we got that. I didn't see it in your testimony because I think that's a poignant point. Now, Mr. Levitt, if citizenship question on a decennial census is racist, then it stands to reason that asking a citizenship question on the American Community Survey, or ACS, is also racist. Do you believe the citizenship question should be removed from the ACS?
I don't believe that asking the question is racist. I believe that asking it in a context when it is least intrusive and when it facilitates the collection of the most accurate data is important. And so, no, I favor keeping it on the ACS. I think that elevating its prominence by putting it in the list of 10 questions asked to every person in the country is a grave mistake.
We disagree. Mr. Levitt, now using an answer on a census questionnaire for the purposes of a law enforcement would be a violation of federal law and subject to a $5,000 fine and 5 years in prison. True?
Correct.
Well, I'm glad we agree on one thing. Now, do you believe that only immigrants and non-citizens have privacy concerns about their responses to the census?
No, I believe those concerns extend beyond.
Well, in fact, I'm glad you brought that up. The Pew Public Trust that you cited in your thing actually shows that Hispanics have a higher value of view of 23% versus whites at 17. So how do you explain that?
I think that there are lots of privacy concerns for citizens with non-citizen family or friends. I think there are concerns for people who live in the community. I think that the concern—
But how do you respond that Hispanics actually have a higher rate than do whites? So they have more trust in the government than does whites.
I don't know that trust in government is essentially racial. I do know that there are communities.
We actually did the survey associated and broke them into those groups. So it seems to me that something's wrong with your assertion that Hispanics and minorities have less trust in the government when whites are at 17%.
I didn't say that they had less trust. I said the trust overall was at 17% across the nation, and that is deeply concerning in this climate, to go asking additional questions on the decennial.
So now let's go back. Do you believe the right to vote should be provided only to citizens?
Yes. In some circumstances, for federal elections, yes, for sure. I know that certain local institutions have decided under their own authority to open that process up.
So would that contingency be made that if they open them up at that aspect, if there's a federal intercedence, that money, for example, wouldn't go to those municipalities based upon not having citizenship actually vote?
I just want to be clear. No citizens are currently allowed to vote in state or federal elections. There are some localities that it's my understanding.
Oh, I understand. And I asked it principally that way, is that it seems to violate the premise of citizenship. And that citizenship depends upon a lot about reimbursement from the federal government down to local municipalities. And so if they weren't going to enforce that voting should be only done by a citizen, then they should not take federal money, right?
That's obviously a policy question for this Congress. There were, I think, a number of the original signers of the Declaration of Independence were not American citizens. A number of signers of the Constitution were not American citizens. So there's been a differential relationship over the course of the country's history. Some states and some local elections have allowed non-citizens to vote, some have not. Currently, it's precluded for all state and federal elections.
So I got another important question. So I'm sure you've heard the phrase vote early and vote often, a phrase often attributed to the corruption in Democratic-controlled areas like Chicago. In your experience, what would DOJ do if the number of votes cast in a county exceeded the number of voting-age citizens?
In my experience, the difference between the actual number of votes cast and the census data is not a reliable estimate of any sort of misdoing. They measure different things at different times.
Wouldn't it cause you alarm?
It would cause me to want to look further, but it would not actually indicate wrongdoing in and of itself.
So, yes or no? I got some short time here. Responses to the citizenship question on the census would help determine voting fraud by comparing the total citizenship population with the total voting population to determine if the fraud has occurred. True?
I think they measure different things. And so I'm not sure that that information would be accurate.
Well, once again, I'm going to go back to statistical applications. You know, let me end by quoting Ken Paxton, Attorney General of Texas. Knowing the number of citizens in any district will help reduce voter fraud by providing a more complete picture of the eligible voters in a district. If there are, say, 300,000 U.S. citizens in a district and 350,000 turn out to vote in an election, we know there's a problem. Mr. Levitt, are you sure that you disagree with that statement?
I do, in part because the census calculates where people lay their heads at night, and voting is not necessarily based on that. There are large numbers of the military, for example, who do not lay their...
But that's a non-factor. I mean, you still
I
know
don't
where
like to
people lay
think of the
their
military as a
Now,
non-factor.
No. We can calculate them in there. What you're doing is you're mixing apples and oranges in that population base.
And it's precisely the concern about
the gentleman's time has expired. You finished the last phrase.
I actually agree with the representative. It's the concern about mixing apples and oranges that makes me think that the census data measures something different than actual voting records in the state.
Well, on that note of harmony, the gentleman from Arizona yields back, and will recognize my friend from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this opportunity to discuss what I think is a very important issue. I'm sorry my colleague and my good friend, Mr. Russell, is not here, because as he stated, citizenship and citizenship being a determinant of one's ability to vote, I was going to ask him to help me co-sponsor legislation that would allow people living in Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Northern Marianas, and the U.S. Virgin Islands to finally be able to vote for president. So as we can see, citizenship really does not always comport with one's ability to vote. This country has a long history of doing that. And also, when he talked about Jefferson wanted to put citizenship and wanted to put a census in the Constitution, history lets us know that Thomas Jefferson was really not a proponent of a very strong Constitution, and actually had to be cajoled, and bargains were made for his agreement to be able to be one of the individuals to help ratify the Constitution. So do we want a weak or do we want a strong Constitution? Do we want people to be counted as citizens or not citizens? So one of the things that I find very troubling about this, and I do believe that it's the timing at which one puts this at, and the elevation of the question is really problematic. Of course, we need to find out who are citizens and who are not citizens, who is receiving benefits and who are not receiving benefits. Those of us who are citizens value our citizenship greatly, and of course want to ensure that because we are American citizens, we are treated special because of that great nation that we're a part of, as opposed to those who are not citizens that live among us. We know that many of them would die to be citizens of the United States. But I think that the elevation is one problematic, as well as something else that's in this census question that I'd like to ask you questions about. One of the things that we've learned is that millions of Americans being displaced has a dramatic effect on the census. So we learned anything from Hurricane Katrina in 2005. It's the recovery from large-scale natural disasters take time. A 2011 report from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights illustrated the challenges to enumeration activities still existed in the Gulf region in 2010, at the time that that census was taken, almost 5 years into Katrina's recovery. Many individuals from Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands were displaced after the recent hurricanes in 2017. And so I'm questioning the report, which also highlighted that 2011 report, large numbers of individuals in temporary housing, informal housing arrangements, high rates of vacant units, and significant changes in both new housing stock and population shifts in affected regions. Dr. Jarman, do you agree that the Bureau is likely to encounter many of these same challenges due to the destruction caused by last year's hurricanes and perhaps future hurricanes?
Yes, we do. We're aware of the challenges we had in 2010 in the Gulf region. We're worried again, the same with the hurricanes in Texas and in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands this year and any subsequent disasters. So we'll be taking steps, changing our operations in those areas, putting more boots on the ground to be able to walk around and make sure that we can find people where they are, working closely with local government officials and other partnership specialists in the area to try to ensure that we put the resources we need to to
and
ensure
how
complete count.
undercounting people who live in affected areas, the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, is particularly problematic, considering that the grant money and federal dollars that we're supported by are often done in a manner and formulas which are significantly different than the rest of the United States. Because although we're citizens, we don't have the right to vote, and therefore we're not able to exert our power in the same way that others are. Would you agree that that may be problematic as well?
So I'm not an expert on that, but I will tell you that we will do everything we can to do a complete and accurate count in all of the areas that we're.
Dr. Jarman, why does the citizenship question ask first if someone is a U.S. citizen, but then breaks affirmative responses into whether the individual is born in the States or one of the territories?
I think that has its origin in many of the issues that you were talking about, whether folks could have members of Congress and vote in presidential elections.
So if now I was not, I was born in what I consider the largest Caribbean island, Brooklyn, but if I was in fact born in the U.S. Virgin Islands, but I decided to live in Maryland, why would the question of where I was born, whether it be in Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands, be of any significance in terms of voting? Because once I set foot and reside in Maryland, I can vote.
The gentlelady's time has expired, but you may answer her question.
So I think we're looking into this to see if there's some potential changes that we could make to that question that would treat the citizens across all territories of the U.S. more equitably, but that's something that we would work with the Congress on.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Comstock and Dr. Jarman are gracious enough to try to stay until questions have exhausted, or 3:30, whichever comes first. With that, the gentleman from Wisconsin, and then we'll go to the gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Comstock, you say you're already using you apparently already use administrative records to enumerate non-responding households. Could you explain to us how you do that a little bit? And are you sure you're not getting a distorted view of things by doing that?
Well, I think actually Dr. Jarman can better answer that question, but yes, you're correct. The census does use some administrative records for certain purposes.
How do we know those are up to date?
Thanks for that question.
Sure.
So in the 2010 census, we did not use administrative records for the purposes of enumeration, but we did many tests to see what it would look like if we did. In 2020, we'll be using administrative records for a small segment of the population who doesn't respond to our inquiries or to the first in-person visit. We know that those records are current because we have a number of different sources of administrative records. They all agree. One particularly important one is we know that they're receiving mail under that name. These are...
I'm not sure that's true. I mean, there are people who receive mail because it was their address at one time or other, and now they're living somewhere else. I think that's highly...
But we also know from records like tax data and stuff like that that they...
People move all the time. I don't think tax data are up to date. I mean, I hate to question on that, but I would be very... I think a lot of people...
We've negotiated a more timely delivery of early tax returns. That is during tax season. And so we are very confident that the housing units that we will be looking at, we have high degree of agreement between multiple sources of administrative records.
I mean, I tell you, I'm from Wisconsin, and there are all sorts of people who are forever moving to Florida, bouncing back and forth between Florida and Wisconsin, and I'm sure they get some mail in Wisconsin and some mail in Florida. You may get a W-2 or something like that, somewhere different than where you're living at the time. I think that's highly problematic and presumptuous. You mean you're telling me that if I file a tax return on, well, we're trying to determine here where you live on January 1, 2020, right?
April 1st.
April 1st, 2020. Okay. And if I file a tax return on January 15th, I could be living somewhere else on April 1st, couldn't I, very easily?
So we we do know some people have multiple addresses, and they are not in the set of folks that we would enumerate in this fashion.
I guess I'm a little bit surprised.
So if we see that a given individual is getting mail and administrative records in two different sources, we would not enumerate them with administrative records. The administrative
you could always catch them. I have another group I can think of.
To agree.
Yeah, another group I can think of is college students. I think the average college student gets, uses one address 9 months of the year, and maybe their permanent address, their parents' address, or maybe their parents are separated or divorced, and then they have 3 addresses. I just think that's fraught with trouble to begin to say somebody lives here, because administratively.
So I think in this setting, this is a relatively complicated technical discussion. It would probably be better if we did this in a different form where we could.
Okay. I'll give you another question. And I honestly don't know this question, because apparently some people think we should be counting people who are illegal, who may hopefully obey the law and return in a month. If I'm here as a guest or on vacation or something from another country for 2 months, am I supposed to fill out the census form?
So the residence rules, state what's your normal. You're supposed to be counted at your normal residence. So if you're here visiting, that's not your normal residence, and you shouldn't respond to the census.
Isn't almost by definition, if I'm here illegally, I'm just here visiting?
If your normal residence is here, whether you're here legally or not, then we would want to be able.
So it's kind of subjective. Sometimes I may count.
So if you're a tourist, you shouldn't be counted.
But I might be counted.
You won't be counted if you're not in a.
Well, if I have a tourist living with me and I got the form and I check them off, I got a.
The residence rules would instruct you not to do so.
How about a foreign exchange student who's here for 9 months? Should they be counted?
Gentleman's time has expired. You may answer the question briefly.
If they're there for that length of time, I'd have to review the residence rules for sure, but that could be.
Gentleman from Wisconsin yields back. The gentlelady from Michigan is recognized.
Dr. German, in April 11 meeting, you told me that instead of actual testing, the Bureau will rely on the census survey to measure how people feel about participating in the census. But since the citizenship question was added so late, the study was already halfway over. Only 200 people in the focus groups would even have known about the question. The study included only 28 people in Detroit and 4 focus groups. Dr. German, do you feel this study accurately measured how our minority communities feel about the citizenship question and participating in the census?
So I haven't seen the results of the study yet. Obviously, we would have liked to have added that to the protocol of those focus groups earlier if we could have. But we'll review the results. Focus groups are not a representative, statistically valid sample of the population, but they do give us insights into how people are thinking about things.
So you're telling me you don't know the results of the...
I have not seen the results, no.
I have a letter from Access, it's an Arab American community group, that says our staff have seen countless immigrant families forego life-saving medical care, triggered by the fear that their immigration status can be used against them. Mr. Chairman, many of our clients will undoubtedly refuse to participate in this 2020 census, and I ask that this letter be entered into the record.
Without objection.
But Dr. German, in addition to the citizenship question, if you're saying that the focus group does not give you a real clear picture, I'm still struggling with why we're putting this question out there, because we have had a census end-to-end test that did not include the question. So you're telling me right now that the focus group doesn't mean that much, but oh, by the way, we're using the focus group to validate it. You don't know the results of it. I have a district that is very blessed to have a strong immigrant population. And I am inundated with concerns about what ICE is doing. Everything is leading toward identifying where you are so that we can come and take you, even though you lived in the country for 20 years.
We would just say once again that that's where it's important that public officials reassure people that this is confidential information.
How can I reassure them when you can't even tell me why it's there?
I think, Congresswoman, you're highlighting the point, which is that the people you're saying would not respond are not responding because they're concerned about interaction with government, period. It has nothing to do with the citizenship question. In fact, Secretary Ross asked that very question and looked very carefully at it. And what the census data showed, that the non-response rates for citizenship were very similar to non-response rates for people who were responding to things like the monthly gas cost, wages and salary income.
So can you stop there? Can you tell me, can you look me in the face today and tell me what is the purpose of the question? Why are you using it when you have an end-to-end census report and you're saying people who will not participate anyway in that question? So why are you asking the question?
We're asking the question because, as has been pointed out, citizenship is a relevant element for determining voting rights. And we have a very serious responsibility, the United States government, to enforce voting right laws. So this is a valid question, and I think—
So for all the years that we've been in America and we've been asking these end-to-end questions, you're saying you've been violating the voters' rights because you have not gathered data in all these years, sir, and I'm sitting in a voters' right drawn district. So you're saying every 10 years that you've done the census, you have denied the rights of the people for voting rights?
No, we're not saying that at all. We're saying that the Justice Department said they would like more accurate information, and we have an obligation to do a complete and accurate count. And you're highlighting a very important point, which is right now, based on the use of administrative records and a review of the point, we now know that those sample surveys that we took were not as accurate as a full count.
I'm going to close because I only have 4 seconds. Sir, I would love to have $1 million. And my salary will not equate to $1 million. I can get it illegally. There's a lot of things I can do. But there is consequences to everything that you do. And you can sit here and say that you have this somebody just wanted it. That to me is not a legitimate reason when you have not validated through their own process that you said that this is not becoming a deterrent to getting getting a full census. And I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I thank the chair. Mr. Comstock, you're a political appointee in this administration?
Yes, I'm in a political appointee slot.
And you actually said to my colleague that the reason for this question is to enhance voter participation.
I don't believe that's exactly what I said.
Oh, well, tell us exactly what you said.
I said the reason for this question was the Justice Department asked this to get more accurate information at the census block level, which we don't currently.
No. You talked about voter participation. You said voters' rights. You talked about voters' rights.
I said to enforce the Voting Rights Act.
Oh, I don't think you said that. I think you talked about voting rights. But, I mean, it was a refreshing thing, whatever it was, because I'm sure then you and the Trump administration will join us in opposing voter suppression methods, given your commitment to voting rights. Purging rolls unnecessarily, really strict voter ID laws, getting rid of satellite voting places, really shortening, if not eliminating, early voting opportunities for voters, those kinds of things that have purged, millions of people from the voting rolls. I'm sure you're going to join us because of your commitment in adding this question to the census.
Well, I just observed that it's states that set the voting rights, the voting laws that you just mentioned, not federal government.
Maybe we can get the President to tweet. He's very good at that. Maybe you can use your good influence. Mr. Levitt, do you agree with Mr. Comstock that there's really no difference between adding this question on citizenship and asking about your gas bill?
I don't, unfortunately.
Why not?
I think that pulling this question up from the middle of a 40-minute, 28-page survey to be one of the now 11 questions we're going to ask every man, woman, and child in the country is a radically different change that has not been tested. I've sewed up a hole on my dog's chew toy, but you don't want me anywhere near open heart surgery. They both involve a needle, but they're dramatically different.
So let's posit that you're right and that it does a lot of harm and that Mr. Comstock is wrong, whatever his good wishes are. It just doesn't work the way he wants it to, and in fact, it does harm. We have much lower participation. We have to send out enumerators, and costs go up. By the way, I had a conversation with Secretary Ross and the General Counsel in which I pled with them not to do this, that would be precisely what would happen. I do admire them for taking my call, but unfortunately, the next day they announced this question. So why do you think they're doing it, Mr. Levitt? Why would an administration add this question, given the risks, given the fact we haven't done it in over 30 years or so, and given the downsides here? The risks are pretty steep.
I don't know. I can't put myself in their position. It does not look like it will achieve what they say they're aiming to achieve, and that's what we call in the law pretext. Look, I hope, I stand with Dr. Jarman, I hope they are successful in getting a complete count of the population. And to that extent, we really want the same thing.
What are the
but I think they're setting themselves up to fail.
What are the downsides, Mr. Levitt, if we don't?
The downsides actually linger for a decade. They go to not only derogation of our constitutional duty, but they go to political representation, and they go to funding, billions and billions and billions of dollars of funding across the decade. And they linger. This cannot be undone is part of the reason that I think those who are watching and those who are active in vulnerable populations are so eager to have testing before we take this giant step. What we've seen so far in the response rates are warnings. The canary in the coal mine has died. And the Census Bureau is essentially forging ahead because it says we're not exactly sure how many miners will die, so we should continue. When you see the canary go, it's time to stop and revisit. And I think what we've been seeing in communities is a lot of fear. We would already be having to act against that, to counter that, to deliver different messages, as Mr. Comstock has said. If the prominence of the citizenship question were not raised, elevating the citizenship question to this level of prominence makes the job of ensuring that everybody's going to stand up and be counted much, 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 much harder.
Thank you. Let me just say in closing, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for having this hearing, there's almost no function of government more profound than the decennial census. It's not only mandated in the Constitution, but it is what provides the blueprint for representational democracy. If we get it wrong, people are underrepresented or overrepresented. The composition of this body is affected by the census. Electoral votes for president are affected by the census. And given the assault on our democracy by the Russians in the last election and the ongoing and lingering questions involved in the investigation by the special counsel, this one is in our power to get right. This is one where we can reassure the public, you don't have to worry about that one. And frankly, injecting a new question about citizenship seems mean-spirited and almost designed to throw a monkey wrench in the works at a time when we don't need any more monkey wrenches. And so I deeply regret the decision. I won't ascribe bad motives to it, but I will ascribe bad judgment. And I hope it doesn't have the kinds of negative results Mr. Levitt has predicted today, but I fear otherwise. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll go last, but I want to start by thanking Mr. Comstock and Dr. Jarman for staying even longer than they agreed to stay. And I won't prolong your departure beyond my 5 minutes. Most of my questions were actually for the witness who did not come. I'm genuinely interested in the historical, the administrative, the legal record for the inclusion of this question. In the first instance, I'm interested in the historical, administrative, or legal rationale for its deletion whenever it was removed, and I'm interested in the record, policy objectives sought to be obtained for its re-inclusion. I'm really interested in the department citing with some specificity how they think the inclusion of this question is going to help them enforce voting rights. And if there are other ancillary benefits to asking this question beyond the enforcement of voting rights, I want to hear that too. I'm also interested from a legal standpoint of what nexus has to exist, if any, between the inclusion of a question and some desired societal benefit. In other words, what is the standard by which whoever is adjudicating this ongoing litigation, what is the standard by which that adjudicator will determine whether or not a question is appropriate or not? But I can't ask, I guess I can ask the questions, I'm just somewhat hamstrung with the answers when the witness does not show.
Mr. Chairman, may I have to get to the floor? May I ask a point to yield with the housekeeping matter about placing into the record statements from many stakeholders?
Sure, I was going to recognize you at the end anyway, but you're welcome to do it now.
Okay, I have to get to the floor. I agree with, thank you. I agree with many things that you're saying. I don't think this question has anything to do with voting rights. It has to do with intimidation, and that's what the letter from the 6 leaders of the Census Bureau said, that they believed it would result in an undercount, as does many other stakeholders, and with unanimous consent to place their statements in the record.
Without objection. I know you got to go, but I actually did have a question during my 5-minute time question, and it's really quick and it's really easy. There are a lot of our fellow citizens that are just so anxious for some good news coming out of a government that they're increasingly losing confidence in. So I'm going to let Mr. Comstock and Dr. Jarman take the remainder of my time, or until you feel like leaving, to assure all of our fellow citizens that the 2020 census is on track to count everyone, and that it's something that they can have confidence in.
I absolutely think that. I mean, I'm not going to say that there's no challenges that we still don't face, but I think we've put an excellent team together that's working hard on this. We have good oversight from GAO and others. We have good partners on our contracting side. There's lots yet to be done, but we're on track to get there. So I'm very confident that we'll have a successful census, but we're going to need everybody's help to do that. This is not something that is completely within our control. We need your help. We need the help of state and local officials for our partnerships, our complete count committees. This is a national effort. This isn't just the Census Bureau. This is everybody has to participate, and so we need to get everybody excited about the census, know that it's important, that it's safe and secure, and that we can get this done together.
Yeah, and I just add that, you know, in Secretary Ross, you've got somebody who is absolutely committed to a complete and accurate count, and he's got the full support of the administration in doing that. So we're very proud of the team that we put together and the work that the Census Bureau is doing.
And I assume, Dr. Jarman, when you say you need everyone's help, you're also including just an average, everyday American who's going to have to decide whether or not to fill out this form.
We need their help the most, sir.
We need their help the most, which is why I think it's important if the Department of Justice can spare one of its employees to come and answer the questions about why that question, why other questions. There's a lot of distrust in government, and one credible witness armed with some really good persuasive answers can do a lot to help. So with that, I want to thank everybody. The committee will recess at the call of the chair. It is my intent that we reconvene at 9 a.m. on Friday, May 18th, to hear from Mr. Gore, whether voluntarily or otherwise. With that, we're in recess.